Colonel Mike Morton. Where's Mike? There he is. Director, U.S. Army Command, U.S. Africa Command Regional Operations, U.S. Army Security Assistance Command. Then Colonel Dave Shank, also Commander, 10th Army Air and Missile Defense Command in Germany. He is executing the duties of Brigadier General, but getting paid as a colonel. So that's right. Like many AMD officers, Dave has served all over the world and supported numerous operations to include Operation Desert Shield and Storm. So he's an antique fixture like myself and many of probably the retired folks out here, Iraqi Freedom, New Dawn, and Enduring Freedom. As we noted earlier, our topic today is about building capacity and forward presence. This will continue to receive a lot of attention, and I think for a good reason, especially when you consider the evolving threats around the world and also the emphasis on sharing and burden sharing. As many of you know, President Trump recently refused to certify key aspects of the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. And I can tell you from where I work in OSD, that's something we specifically have been working on due to concerns with its missile development program, among several issues, but that's certainly one of them. One thing you all may have noticed is Secretary Mattis himself. He directed what we euphemistically call as the petting zoo of some of the missiles that have been shot north into Saudi Arabia. That's now over at Bolling Air Force Base. So just to assure you that there's a lot of focus on that. Although many countries view this agreement as a success in curbing Iran's military nuclear aspirations, they too have condemned Iran's missile activities as being inconsistent with the UN Resolution 2231. It's also important to note that although Iran possesses a formidable arsenal of short and medium-range ballistic missiles, much of their efforts over the past decade have been enhancing their accuracy rather than their range. And if you've listened carefully to some of our partners in the Middle East, to include Israel, you have heard some of their concerns about this. Won't get into that, though. This, according to Michael Elliman with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. That said, many remain concerned about the possible transfer of space launch technology, and even greater concern to the development of intercontinental ballistic missile systems. To date, Iran has delivered at least 3 satellites into orbit. And then we haven't even talked about North Korea. Last year, it conducted its 6th of the most powerful nuclear tests to date and test launched 3 ICBMs with its stated goal of reaching anywhere in the U.S. According to Seoul-based Korea National Diplomatic Academy, the DPRK strategy is to continue to develop and improve its arsenal while trying to weaken international pressure and the U.S.-South Korean alliance. In light of these, many of the emerging threats, the strategy of maintaining a forward, robust presence has become a topic of much discussion. A recent military review article highlighted many of the important aspects of this policy. First and foremost, deterring war. As even Thucydides has taught us, while diplomatic and economic power can play a significant role, many view the military as the ultimate means to deter war. Secondly, assuring allies as to our commitment, while enabling the U.S. to pursue an effective geopolitical management strategy. Also, stemming regional arms race. As we're seeing in various parts of the world, this is very critical. According to the article, forward presence also assists in shaping the security environment and possibly preventing conflict, while maintaining operational access. Should efforts fail to secure a peaceful resolution, and then finally, many contend that maintaining a forward presence plays a key role in building partnership capacity, whether fixing readiness shortcomings or possibly establishing a new military force or security institutions. Currently, Admiral Fogo, the commander of Allied Forces Command, Commander U.S. Navy Forces Command, has noted that our European partners have become increasingly interested in integrating missile defense, as Moscow has ramped up operations not only in the Med, but also with increased patrols in the Baltic and North Atlantic. The challenge remains balancing the resources demand with maintaining a forward presence, with many others facing the Defense Department, like nuclear modernization, revitalization of ground forces, expansion of the F-35 fleet, and the ground-based interceptor fleet, to name a few. Finally, President Trump has also expressed his desire for a more equitable sharing of reasonable costs and responsibility, especially as the U.S. accounts for 75% of the NATO military expenditures. So that's a scene setter that Lieutenant General David Mann kind of set out for us. I hope I delivered effectively. And now I'll sit down and make a few comments of my own.
Joe, before we go on,
yes.
Frank, you want to introduce Dell too?
Okay.
Sure.
Down the far end there is Dell Turner, retired general officer and former USASAC commander, currently with Raytheon. And the younger brother of the Turner I worked for, Tom Turner.
And thank you for that reminder, sir. And my apologies, sir, for skipping over you. So just wanted to make a few observations that I had and a few comments to for the group. Building partner capacity and maintaining a forward presence. I think there is a correlation between the two. I was able to see that. Most of you all are obviously the air defense professionals, but kind of being an outsider, watching it happen on the ground in the UAE, it occurred to me as I would see a number of the 32nd commanders come through from whether it's General Fritz or General Spillman now, my buddy now up in the Joint Staff, Clem Coward. We had this discussion. Why do we have a U.S. asset and an Emirati asset defending the same, if you will, critical asset? Is there not a way to preserve a U.S. asset by having a foreign partner? And of course, you all could probably tell me the reasons and expound on the challenges for those. But I think we're getting to a point based on what I just indicated from what the president. I also brought I'm sure we've all read Secretary Mattis's both classified and unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. But in here, he's very explicit about our partners playing a more important role and playing a role that will allow us to share the burden with them. And when I look at some of our other elements that we have partnered in the UAE, or rather U.S. elements that are partnered with the UAE, even in Yemen, for example. And what I would just, I guess, challenge the group as maybe a question for later for maybe some of the panelists is could we use the model that our SOF forces use, kind of the buy with through model? General Votel often speaks of, with our air defense forces. I mean, right now, for example, it's no secret, we've talked about it openly, that we have if you look at what we're doing, with the SDF, in Syria, what we're doing with the Emirati forces in Yemen. We have boots on the ground in Yemen, small numbers that we've talked about. We're able to remove Al Qaeda from an area, a whole emirate. They were in control of $1 million a day equity from oil in Yemen. But by with through small numbers, we were able to do that. Is there a model to where we could use a similar model with maybe partnering with host nation air defense forces where yes, we would have a forward presence, but maybe that forward presence takes a different role of a kind of advise, assist, and accompany, and maybe that can help us work through some of the challenges that are out there, even though I think some of those challenges, and again, you all know these better than I do, the challenges of cybersecurity, of flow of information from maybe external sources, early warning. So that's a thought that I wanted to share with you from kind of the outside, not being the air defender, saying, hey, how can this community, I know we can't, it's apples and oranges a little bit, but is there a way to kind of change the paradigm a little bit and look at how to do this? So with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first start by saying what a real honor it is again to participate in the hot topic this year. It's been great seeing, obviously, so many familiar and friendly faces, and having an opportunity to learn so much from the previous panelists and the discussions there. So thanks again for letting me participate one more time here. I'll keep my remarks brief, obviously, so we can have more time for Q&A and discussion, where I think some of the real meat on this topic and many others will actually be discussed. But I did want to reinforce a couple of earlier highlights, starting with the fact that the world is changing. Weaved through essentially every panel as I listened today, that was a common theme and a common message. That we live in a multipolar and multi-domain global operating environment. To pull this thread a little bit more like many others, I'm going to go to the National Defense Strategy. General Rank had a copy, I've got a copy, and many of you over the weeks since its publication have had a copy and read through that. And I think that gives us a pretty good understanding of the direction we're going. So I'm going to use that to frame some of my remarks. First, in that it says that increased global disorder is creating what the NDS calls a security environment more complex and volatile than any we have experienced in recent history. Again, this is right out of the UNCLAS summary. It goes on to state in very stark terms that America's military has no preordained right to victory on the battlefield. I thought that was pretty stark and pretty sobering. A more lethal, resilient, and innovating joint force combined with, and I like this language, a robust constellation of allies and partners is what the NDS says we need, or what it will take, for us to sustain American influence and ensure a favorable balance of power. So tying that statement to this panel, building partner capacity and maintaining forward presence, we find ourselves right in line with the senior leadership in this senior document, which is, of course, always a good thing. In fact, the NDS doubles down on this by calling out the fact that strengthening alliances as we attract new partners is actually the second of 3 lines of effort in the document. And I think most powerfully states and describes our network of allegiances and partnerships as literally, and using its words, the backbone, calling it the backbone of global security. So in that context, or that statement, why this is such a critical topic, in many ways, our allies and partners represent our asymmetric advantage over the enemy, or the adversary or the enemy. I mean, we talk in lots of terms about asymmetric activities, actions, operations from an enemy perspective. Our allies and partners actually represent our asymmetric advantage over our adversaries. The reason I think that leveraging our relationships is so important, it's obviously important, and it's been touched on several times today, is that we, especially in the air and missile defense community, are continuing to find our amazing soldiers deployed all over the world addressing this adversary's growing capability and capacity. These incredible young warriors, with the support of their families, are accomplishing what can only be described as a complex, tough, and can't-fail mission, and it's getting tougher each and every day, and you know that very well. It's easy then to understand that partner capacity, or as I like to call it, partner contributions, are already critical to our success, and they are becoming even more so every day. So as I thought about this, we don't have to get to yes on this. We're already there. I mean, it's laid out in our national defense strategy. We are already at yes with respect to allies and partners. But there seem to be some challenges, and we touched on a few of those today, that have prevented us from fully leveraging the synergy that follows effective collaboration, integration, and interoperability with our partners. challenges, just to name a few, in the area of technology, policy, training and education, disclosure and releasability, and cybersecurity are just a couple that we and our partners have to contend with. And hopefully we can discuss some of those during the Q&A. But despite these challenges, I'll tell you that I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. This is the positive glass half full spin on this, and we've made significant progress in this area. The problem is that the threat is pushing us to move even more quickly, as Secretary Mattis said in the NDS, and many have talked about here today, that we've got to move at the speed of relevance. Now, we've heard many examples of how we've overcome some of these challenges, and I'd like to add two and talk to you a little bit about JFCC IMD very briefly on some of the things that we provide in overcoming some of these challenges. The first, and many of the folks out in this audience or people that you know have participated in this and are alumni of this program, is our Joint Ballistic Missile Defense Training and Education Center, JBTech. Now, you may have seen it out there. There's a red folder, and I've brought some of this, some literature, a trifold, and a senior leader reference card that our world-class instructors provide not only to U.S. And interagency, not just military, but interagency students, but also to multinational folks through some FMS cases. World-class training. They've trained over 4,000 individuals over the last year, and I would ask you to just pick up a copy of that if you know somebody that may need, you would think, benefit from some of this training. This is world-class training, and we literally do this all over the world, so I would ask you to take a look at that. And a second thing that we do to overcome some of these challenges, and General Dickinson touched on it in his opening remarks, was our Nimble Titan campaign. Greg Brady made a very important statement, and he said you can't surge trust. Right? That is very, very important, and it's so true. You can't surge trust, so you've got to build that trust before you have to find yourself, or before you find yourself on the battlefield with our allies and partners. Nimble Titan is an unclassified, as General Dickinson touched on it, an unclassified campaign of experimentation between 28 nations and international organizations. It's unclassified, but it gets to some of the policy kinds of decisions, TTP, concepts, joint defense designs. It's really an amazing program that JFCC IMD runs on behalf of U.S. STRATCOM, and it helps to build that trust before we actually find ourselves for real on the battlefield side by side doing this critical mission. So I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully I didn't run over my time. But I just want to say thanks again. I love coming to these events. I learned so much, and it's, of course, great to see everyone. And I'll pass it over to Mr. Karako for his comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm Tom Karako from CSIS, and I'm going to, I think, focus on the second half of the panel title, which is to say maintaining forward presence, because I think the question of what exactly we want our partners to build capacity of is a function of the more complex environment that we face today. And since everybody else is footnoting the NDS, I'll footnote that particular phrase, I think it's from page 7, that talks about the desire, the fact that our adversaries have gone to school on us, and the utility of more dispersed and resilient basing concepts. And so I'm going to weave that into what I'm talking about here. And so I'm really drawing on a study that we released at CSIS called Distributed Defense, the idea being taking some characteristics of distributed lethality and taking them ashore and applying them to air and missile defense. The challenge, of course, is the return of great power competition and the presence of missile-rich threat sets. And it's not just about ballistic missiles anymore, but that broad spectrum that we've been hearing about all day across all characteristics of altitude, propulsion, flight profile, and range. And so it's that specter of complex integrated attack with a combination of air and missile threats that is probably the challenge we want to build up our partners' capacity in. And the bottom line here is that, unfortunately, I think that we face today the specter of today's AMD force being all too susceptible to suppression. Let me say that again, all too susceptible to suppression. Against high-end threats, the first to fire force may be the first to be fired upon. The Houthis in Yemen today, we heard reference to them just a moment ago. The Houthis are advertising the fact that they're targeting Saudi and Emirati Patriot radars with drones of their own. And so, you know, there's a handful of basic shortcomings that we've been trying to get after for some time, one of which is stovepipes of excellence, much vertical integration but not enough horizontal. Too many single points of failure, under focus on non-ballistic threats, high cost and low capacity, and really an over-reliance upon sectored ground-based radars. And so, you know, coming at this not merely through, you know, faster interceptors and bigger and more powerful radars, not merely in terms of capacity and capability, but different ways of, different concepts, material and enabling concepts. Are there different ways to carve up the AMD and offensive fires problem in different ways that could contribute to survivability and resilience? In other words, we've been talking about integration and IBCS, and that's all great, but after integration, then what? What is it that might enable that could allow us to adapt to this much more complex environment? A couple of things. One, element dispersal. You know, being able to break up elements, sensors and shooters through that more network-centric thing. Mixing and matching, not merely of sort of SHORAD with low and higher tier defensive fires, but maybe even offense and defense together. And then we kind of move to talk about really one of the imperatives of Vision 2020, which is, and I believe it's the case, that Vision 2020 Joint IAMD says it's the responsibility of every commander to talk about passive defense. And so, you know, we kind of toy with some ideas of what if we were to go back to something that was in the FCS program, rockets and boxes, net fires, both for defensive and offensive purposes, and spreading them out, say across a base at the very least, and really embracing decoys. Because, again, those Houthis can find that radar, they can find that launcher and target it, but having lots of decoys to complicate the surveillance and targeting job of the bad guys. That's central to the distributed lethality concept, and I think applying it in this way might be interesting as well. This really permits a shell game, right? A shell game, and in the kind of scenarios that say a Russia moves in and pops up an A2AD bubble, there may be cargo containers, or rather what appear to be mere cargo containers within their bubbles. And this might permit, as it were, fires that are bursting their bubbles from the inside out. They may have them under them and not even know it. And let me just say a couple other little things here about the international cooperation side. We might get into some of the challenges in the Q&A, but let me just list a couple. One of them that I think we ought to be a couple that we ought to be especially attentive to is the geopolitical. These great powers that we are identifying forthrightly are doing their very darndest to drive wedges and look for ways to persuade our partners or our allies not to do those interoperable things, not to do those hosting arrangements. Cost, of course. You know, we talk about building carton capacity, but there's the Polands of the world that there's only so much that they can afford. Offense-defense trade-offs. Some smaller partner is not going to be able to necessarily afford all the AMD force that we might want them to have, and they may prefer more offensive things. And then there's the question of whether and to what extent building partner capacity actually reduces U.S. requirements. And does it actually do that? With what kind of relationships would the United States, for instance, permit itself to be defended by somebody else, as opposed to having to rely upon them? So let me just leave it there and pass it on.
Good afternoon. My name is Colonel Mike Morton. Again, I work at the U.S. Army Security Assistance Command, where I'm the Director of Foreign Military Sales Operations for the countries in EUCOM and AFRICOM. Like General Rank, I'm also a Middle East Foreign Area Officer and also a Armor Officer on top of that, so I'm quite sure my Uber driver dropped me off at the wrong place this afternoon. On behalf of Mr. Robert Moore, the USASAC's Executive Director, I'd like to thank AUSA for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Building partner capacity is written into USASAC's mission and also into our DNA, and nested with the SecDef's intent to improve our international partners' capabilities. USASAC leads the Army Material Command Security Systems Enterprise as it provides air defense capabilities to our partner countries. These include partners that have long-standing Patriot programs like Germany, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Israel, and Japan, but also countries that are developing new Patriot programs. These are Sweden, Poland, and Romania, and others. Core to USASAC's mission of providing air defense capability is a total package approach. So not only are we selling missiles and launchers and radars, we're also selling the spare parts, the sustainment and technical support, the publications, and the training to ensure that our partners are not only using and maintaining this equipment today, but into the future years. So with that, thank you again for the invitation to participate in this panel, and I look forward to the questions.
Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel Dave Shank, as mentioned, the commander of 10th Army Air and Missile Defense. And, sir, just want to take a moment to thank you and your team with the invite today, my first one. So it's exciting to be here, and I look forward to coming back. Thanks, sir. So this is a great opportunity for myself to showcase and brag a little bit about 10th AAMDC and what's going on in Europe and Israel as we continue to support U.S. Army Europe, U.S. Air Forces Europe, Navy Europe, as well as our combatant command, European command, and how we continue to get after building the partner capacity and maintaining that forward presence. I've got three areas I'd like to just mention briefly. The first one is U.S. Army operations, U.S. Army Europe operations in support of a joint and multinational environment. We take every opportunity to maximize joint and multinational integration, from academics to tabletop exercises to field training exercises. Interoperability and technical integration are primary drivers for every one of these events. Capacity and capability is a great discussion, but if we cannot create that shared air picture across a multitude of ADA sensors and shooters, then we're failing. You have heard some of the larger exercises mentioned earlier today, which we've conducted over the last 9 months. This is the way forward. Bigger is more challenging. The Tobruk Legacies, Artemis Strike live fire exercises, and the ongoing exercise right now, Juniper Cobra, where we have over 300 soldiers from Task Force BMD deployed to Israel at this time, conducting the ramp-up operations in preparation for next week's commencement. We recognize that we will not do this alone. Number two, U.S. Army Europe is a test bed for the Army. As we support the Commandant's modernization line of effort, we welcome systems ready to be field tested. Some of these have included in the past the Dismounted Patriot Information Coordination Central, the DIPIC, which 5780A had the opportunity to test the prototype for approximately 18 months, going back to Anaconda 2016. The CSA's initiative of the man-pad Stinger teams in a maneuver formation. We leverage this opportunity, the training conducted by the ADA Schoolhouse, by identifying the top 6 teams, making it a competition, and taking those teams from the 2nd Cavalry Regiment and the 173rd Airborne to Crete to participate in our Stinger, Avenger, and Patriot live fire. The directed energy weapon, which is en route or on location at this time. We will put air defenders on that system. It's a FIST vehicle, and we will have air defenders who will participate in the live fire and the maneuverability of that system on the battlefield in a training environment. And then lastly, the numerous ornaments which have been hung on the Stryker platform. The 2nd Cav Regiment is spearheading this effort. They have fielded the 30-millimeter gun, the CIMIC, and soon to be the trophy as well for that system. So we continue, and I recognize the short-range air defense platforms, which are also being considered for that chassis. I close this area recognizing Syria has been serving as Russia's test bed, and we need to do the same in Europe. Number 3 is the 10th AAMDC growth, and it needs to be an enterprise approach. The growth of the 10th AAMDC began in FY17 with an approved FDU of 41 billets. This includes 14 series officers and NCOs, an attack operations section of field artillery men and women, and non-14 series personnel, to name a few. And as most know, the Chief of Staff of the Army approved the command to fleet up to a 1-star billet in summer 2019, which has impacts on the FY19 Modified Troops Organization and Equipment, specifically 406 colonels to serve on the staff. Mentioned earlier by Brigadier General Sheriff, the 678th ADA Brigade, the Mission Command element, is settling down tonight in Ansbach, Germany. They will serve as that echelon which previously did not exist in the 10th Army Air and Missile Defense Command. This is a big deal. In addition, we received an Avenger battery, also happens to be from the South Carolina Army National Guard, in January, and they are currently deployed at Grafenberg Training Area, going through sets and reps in support of the European Deterrence Initiative. And though awaiting an overseas force structure change decision from the Secretary of Defense, conditions are being set to receive an active component Avenger Battalion to Shipton Barracks in October of this year. I recognize the manning challenges across the ADA branch, but also recognize the need for an enterprise approach to get this right. If not, the impacts will be far greater than U.S. Army Europe and the 10th AAMDC, but across the ADA branch and the Army. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Del Turner. I commanded the Army Security Assistance Command, USASAC, for about 3 years, and for the last 3 years, been working with Raytheon. So I have a perspective from both sides of the fence here, I think, that can be helpful. First of all, I'd like to thank General Swan for hosting this event, for AUSA hosting it, and you personally, sir. I tell you, it's a great event. Great things came out of last year's, the Geons from Korea, and so it's a great event, and I look forward to participating here. Quick story. So I take command of USASAC on the 30th of September 2011, and in the parade field, it's out on the parade field behind AMC headquarters. Some of you have been there. Beautiful morning, great ceremony. Went over to the reception. It was in some tents off to the side of the parade field there. Spent about 20 minutes at the reception. Had a meeting to go to, and so I go back upstairs and I'm ready to go into my office for the first time as a CG of USASAC, and I go by my executive assistant's desk, Barbie Mumau, and she has somebody on the phone, and she's saying, "Yes, sir, yes, sir," and she looks at me and she goes, "Sir, it's Gene Blackwell from Raytheon. Can you talk to him?" And I said, "Sure." And so I go in the office, and I didn't know General Blackwell at the time. But I'm sure he's going to congratulate me on taking command. It's going to be a good conversation. So I pick up the phone, Turner, and he says, "Hey, Turner, what are you going to do to unscrew this Kuwaiti border surveillance case?" I thought, Kuwait, I've been there. Border surveillance case for Kuwait. And actually, the conversation started out with, Turner, this is Gene Blackwell. Do you know who I am? And so, yes, sir. And we had a good conversation after that. But the lesson that I learned that day, and I continued to learn over about the next 3 or 4 months at USASAC, was that the best intelligence I got on how my command was doing was from industry partners and also from the international partners. We didn't really have a good way of seeing ourselves at USASAC to understand how we were doing, case by case, across the full life cycle of the FMS case. I got that intel from industry partners and from the international partners calling me, wanting to know where their case was, where the contract was on a specific thing. And so, I kind of embraced that. And I said, we need to be partners with these people, with industry and the international partners. And that's, I've got 3 things I'd like to talk to today before the question and answer period. We get into some other insights during the Q&A session. But the first one is, I am more convinced than ever after 3 years in industry that this security cooperation enterprise is a 3-legged stool. It's the international partner, it's the U.S. government, and kind of leading that that stool, and then the final one is industry. And to the extent that that 3-legged stool or that enterprise works together on the FMS process, that drives the success of security assistance. Particularly on the left-hand side of what we call case implementation. So if you look at the FMS case, the life cycle of an FMS case from pre-LOR before the country defines the requirement that they're trying to achieve, in both capability and time. And like General Dickinson and many others have said here today, delivering performance at the speed of relevance is just as important to an international partner as it is to the U.S. Army. But if you look at it from pre-LOR all the way to case closure, on the left-hand side is what I call the art of security cooperation, security assistance. That's where you're getting the customer to define his requirements, his capabilities, and you're starting to write the offer back to that country. There's tremendous opportunities for the U.S. government to improve and increase the cooperation among those three partners, international partner, U.S. government, and industry, to improve that process. The second item I'd like to talk about, and you in industry in the crowd out here know this very well, and some of the military do. We don't have an awful lot of military people that have remained, but and that is the very real financial benefit that FMS brings to the U.S. government. Okay, use the Patriot program as an example here. The U.S. has enjoyed tremendous savings. The U.S. Army has enjoyed tremendous savings on the Patriot program from both a modernization of hardware and also a sustainment of the system. And we estimate that we've had about $800 million over the last 10 years invested by foreign partners in modernization efforts for Patriot. So the modern Mann station, the radar digital processor, the modern adjunct processor, all have been paid for. The RDT&E costs have all been paid for by international partners. We also estimate there's probably about $500 million more of potential investments for future upgrades to the Patriot. The one frustration that most people have with FMS is it's very uncertain as to when a partner is going to sign the LOA, or it takes a lot of time. It's uncertain on the timing of the money coming in. Like one of the other panelists said here, the more you can link arms with the partner and engage those partners, and particularly as a group, as we have with the Patriot user group, linking arms with those partners allows you to see the potential investments in the future years and then fold that into the domestic program of record. Those were on the investment of upgrades and modernization to Patriot. On the sustainment side, I think with the advent of the International Engineering Services Program back in 1992, there's been close to $2 billion that have been invested or paid for by international partners in the sustainment of Patriot. $2 billion. Now, typically the U.S. In that consortium pays for about 33% of the sustainment, and the foreign partners pay for about 67% of it. So you can do the math there, but $2 billion from international investors or partners of Patriot, those 13 other nations that use Patriot, probably about $600 to $700 million from the U.S. Army. And so a great opportunity here to, like the panelist said, link arms with the international partners and see where there might be opportunities for investment in upgrades in the future. And then the last area I'd like to talk about here, where we might cooperate more, U.S. government and industry, is in offering that the U.S. Army and DSCA might expand their capacity and their inclination to do more non-standard case management for selling of non-programs of record that industry has. If you come at this, if you view this from a security cooperation perspective, vice a FMS support to Army programs of record, then you can see the benefits for each member, three members of that stool that I was talking about. For the international partners, they desire customized solutions, not necessarily a program of record that the Army or some other service has. And so you're able to fulfill the specific need of the international partners and their custom requirements. From an industry perspective, it keeps product lines open, it expands the market, allows us to develop technologies that the U.S. is not ready to commit to yet, and have the international partner do that. From a U.S. government perspective, from the Army's perspective, you're able to deploy something, a one-off system or a technology or a capability that the Army, like I say, has not committed to in a program of record, have them develop that on their dime, and then for potential inclusion into a program of record at some point later for the for the U.S. Army. Now, the model that I'm proposing here doesn't go as far as the one that you're probably familiar with, and that is the non-standard rotary wing program inside of PEO Aviation, which is a very formal PM shop, and it receives money from FMS admin funding from DASADEC. The Air Force has a much less onerous model, which is a couple of engineers and program management people in appropriate PEOs, and then they handle the non-standard cases that come up within that PEO. And the arrangement that's typically worked out is that the U.S. government picks up those things left of signing of the case. So with the receipt of the letter of request from the country, the developing of price and availability data, the congressional notification, the development of a letter of offer and acceptance back to the country, all of those things can be funded fairly cheaply by the U.S. government. And then the government, the international customer, agrees to pick up the cost for the case management to the right-hand side. So if they buy the material, if they buy the system, if they buy that technology or solution, then they're agreeing to do fund the case management of that case to the right, and that's where the significant costs are. We had a great opportunity, as an example here, of doing this with JLens in one of the Gulf Coast countries, and I'm not necessarily selling JLens, but the capability that JLens brings, and that is the elevated persistent surveillance, is a capability this partner was looking to invest in, and it's something that could have been developed overseas and then brought back into the U.S. Army or DOD. So those are the three things that I have here to start off with. Greater cooperation, between the three legs of the stool there. The great money that's available from the international customers to come back into a program, and then finally the proposal that the U.S. government, and I'll hand this over to Mike Morton here as an action for USASAC, but to look at expanding their capacity and their desire to do non-standard case management of FMS cases. Thank you.
Okay, well, I've got a handful of questions here, and I'll start to put them out to the group. Oftentimes, the U.S. government does not or cannot share sensitive capabilities with our partners on foreign disclosure issues. This becomes a complicating factor. How do we build partner capacity if we're unwilling to share capabilities or technology? Jump on that grenade.
I'll take a swing at that, sir. So if we are, the way you phrase that, it's very important in my mind. If we are unwilling, then I say there's probably no chance, a zero chance of success. And that gets to, I had listed a few of the challenges. Technology, I think, frankly, technology is the easiest problem to solve. I'm absolutely confident that the United States of America put a man on the moon 50 years ago or close to it, can solve the technological issues that would face us in some of these integration kinds of things. We talked a little bit about trust, and again, ability and willingness are two different things. So if the question is if we are unwilling to do it, then I would say that we stand little chance of actually realizing the value of true integration with our partners. Now, having said that, again, just looking at it being a human dimension, when you talk about the willingness as opposed to the ability, I think that's the much more complex part of the equation. So I think that this is going to require absolutely that we have to reframe our way of thinking. We have to assume risk. Because again, it's pick your poison. You're trading one kind of risk for another. Risk to the force or the mission versus potential risk that there may be some sort of disclosure. I would offer, especially as our allies and our partners get more and more of these systems, that risk is going to reduce because again, they have these are very similar sophisticated systems that we have. So I would offer the greater of those two risk options is risk to mission or force, as opposed to risk of disclosure. So that would be my question: is we first have to be willing to do this, and if not, I think we're going to be we're not going to like the results.
I'd just like to add on to that. I'm not as eloquent a speaker as Kevin, so forgive me here. But 3 simple points, and we recognize this, and I don't know if Greg Brady's still here. I saw him. But we saw this last summer in Sabre, Guardian, and Tobruk Legacy. The first thing you got to do is you got to talk about it. I think the second thing you got to do is you got to build that team to talk about it. Okay, and that's gathering all the players. So it's the DAMO SSEs, it's the PEO Missiles in Space, it's our higher headquarters at European Command, and of course it's 10th Double AMDC, amongst others. And then you got to continue to pursue it. And the only example that I can think of, and I could be wrong, it wouldn't be the first time today, but the first challenge we pursued was, hey, the question was, how come other Patriot user nations cannot come into our bands? And my thought process was, well, no one ever asked. So we pursued that. And now we have that approval where current Patriot user nations can come into our engagement control stations. I mean, it sounds a lot simpler than what it was, but it was the right group of personnel coming together and receiving that approval. Simple example. Thanks.
Okay, to the panel in general. Partners often state U.S. weapons are too expensive. They claim we try to recoup research and development costs. We add burdensome administrative costs onto the production costs that make us non-competitive. Are we considering concepts that will make U.S. systems more cost competitive for our partners to procure?
I'll take that. Another story. It's like the 3rd or 4th of February after I'd taken command here. I'd been there for about 5 months, and I'm in the barber chair on a Saturday morning, and I get a call from J.B. Burns, who was here earlier today. And this was a case of where a foreign partner had decided not to buy the 777 howitzer, and I had been briefed on it the night before, and it was a case of the per unit cost for this thing was going to be, let's just say, $3 million for example's sake. And so I'm relaying that to JB, and I said, yeah, evidently the unit cost on this thing was about $3 million. And he goes, no. He says, that was your cost. That wasn't our cost. And it really hit me upside the head there, as most things that JB tells me to do. But when you go back and drill down into it, this total package approach that Colonel Morton talked about is very good. But the way that the case is developed too often is in a stovepipe fashion. So the case is brought in, for 777 howitzers, and it's sent down to Fort Sill for a training cost. It's sent for, spare parts cost. And each one of these pieces of the total package approach are developed independently. It comes back to USASAC, it's aggregated, and it becomes a $3 million bill for a howitzer that BA&E was going to sell for, let's say, $1 million. And so I really think that this is another area where government and industry can cooperate, and that is to, before we send something back to the foreign government, is have a review, and particularly on the larger cases. And we saw this on Poland with the Patriot and the IBCS case that just went back over there. There are an awful lot of, there's a premium added at each one of those different stovepipes that adds something to the case. And I think that through more central management of the case over time, over the course of the case, 20, 30 years, which is what Poland will probably have Patriot, you can look at drawing down that premium over the course of the whole case and tell the sustainers or the spare parts people they're going to have to just do it at 10% overage, and that if that became a problem over the course of the case, we can move funds around on the case. But I think typically that's where the sticker shock comes from, is just the aggregation of these different stovepipes, and then this case is sent over, and then you have to go through the line by line, and that's tedious, and so that's my experience there, Brian.
Can I offer another thought on that, sir? The other thing is in some cases it may be too expensive. I mean, that may just be the reality for that particular nation, and I don't think we should look beyond that, and I think we should appreciate that not every nation has the resources that we're blessed to have here in the United States. How might we be able to get around that? Code development, and there's examples of that. There's plenty of examples of that. I look at the SM3 Block 2 Alpha as a perfect example of code development. Collective capabilities, where maybe one country provides the effector, one country provides a sensor, one country provides C2 capabilities. So again, you can combine those capabilities. That's a little bit more advanced in some of the cooperation, but a way. Or other capabilities altogether that can provide or facilitate for our capabilities in their theater. I talked about this last year, about the difference between apples to apples comparisons or contributions and apples to oranges. Apples to apples is what I think we focus often too much on, in that, if they don't have a full-on Patriot battalion capability, well, then somehow they're not contributing. I would argue that that's not true, because there are apples to oranges kinds of comparisons, basing rights, access to the regions, basic access, spectrum use, host nation security, physical security. These are things that they can contribute to enable our capability to go in and be successful in achieving our objectives and our goals. They can also look, and this has been brought up several times today, at things other than active defense, intel, surveillance, reconnaissance, passive defense capability, attack operations. These are all contributions that they can make without necessarily having to buy some of these high-dollar systems that can be really meaningful in our ability to achieve our objectives. So I think that there's other ways that we could view this problem set besides just saying, hey, you have to buy the end items or the systems. I think there's other ways around it.
I just wanted to add, because I've been involved in some of this discussion with General Hodges before he retired. A lot of discussion about 2% contribution across the NATO partners. And to your point, Kevin, is how do we view that 2%? Is it based on numbers of troops, numbers of tanks, or is it highways? Is it ports? Is it infrastructure? And should we be giving these countries constructive credit? That's probably not the right term for that, but we tend to look at this strictly as combat capability, and maybe that's not appropriate. I don't know how it's being looked at in Europe now.
Well, I can concur, obviously, with you with regards to General Hodges, and spot on. For example, Poland has an extremely large training area that they are receiving that credit, as you mentioned, sir, towards their 2%. There are a number of rail lines, Autobahn improvements, which are being made across the eastern flank to help us get to that speed of assembly to get to those locations. So I know some of the countries are receiving credit for those type of events.
Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been using the Patriot system to counter TBMs out of Yemen. In some cases successfully, in some cases unsuccessfully, and in some cases we just don't really know. The question is a U.S. entity collecting data, or are the partners collecting data on their engagements, sharing it with us, and are we gleaming lessons learned or engineering changes?
I could take a poke at that. I do know that we have some access. I don't know how complete it is, but I've seen some of that take place. So I can only imagine that we're then using that access to do some analysis, but I don't think it's 100%. And of course, it's challenging when you have, radars and launchers, in harm's way to kind of get that information back and forth. But I do know that it's taking place to a certain degree.
I'll just say my project at CSIS has tried to chronicle what's publicly available in the news for the Yemen missile war. And so since March of 2015, we've tried to keep tabs on every seemingly legitimate public engagement, miss, strike or intercept. And so take a look at our website, missilethreat.csis.org, and we try to put not only the numbers, but the dates, where it's being targeted, where being fired from, to the fullest extent that's out there in open source.
Sir, just one other thought on that. Irrespective of the actual statistics, I think what this really highlights for us is an incredible level of progress in the AOR. The very fact that we're having this discussion about the Emiratis, the Saudis, or other nations that are fighting that fight down in and around Yemen is really indicative of incredible progress that's happened over the last 25 plus years since Desert Storm, where it was only the United States. I think that this is a real positive sign that we are even talking about this. I had an opportunity when I was deployed to meet with the Emirati leadership there, the battalion and brigade commanders. They were rightfully proud of this and their contribution to what amounts to a multinational missile defense fight, the exact kind of thing we're talking about. They're executing that in a combat environment. So I think that that's a real positive indication of progress over the last 25 plus years.
So just to the panel in general, how important is the role that the interagency plays in security assistance? And is the process functioning, or does it need improvement?
So I'll start with that, and I'm sure, sir, you have some thoughts. So yes, you know, the Army may want to sell a requirement to a nation. A nation may come to the Army and say, here's what the capability I'm looking for, but it's not up to the Army all the time as far as whether that capability is sold. Obviously, the Congress plays a large role in that. The Congress is given through a congressional notification process 30, 45 days to take a look at this, and that's formally. There's some informal time that's added on to the process. So that's why we hear sometimes from our customers, you know, the foreign military sales process takes a long time. We have to go through Congress as the first step. And then back towards the interagency, not only in the Pentagon, but also across in Foggy Bottom, and the State Department also has to take a good hard look at this and whether we're going to sell this capability to a nation. At the end of the day, the foreign military sales process or program is administered by the Department of Defense, but it is a State Department program, so they have the final say. Sir?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You know, this is arms transfer is foreign policy, and this is a Department of State program executed by the Department of Defense. My experience was that most FMS cases went through, you know, the vast majority of them went through without issue, but there were concerns on, you know, and considerations with safeguarding technologies, with regional balances of power, with human rights considerations. All these things go into the mix, but not that often. You know, for a couple countries, for a couple different weapon systems, maybe the vast majority of security assistance efforts, you know, fly through the thing. But at the end of the day, like Colonel Morton says, this is a Department of State tool. It's, you know, arms transfers are foreign policy.
Hey, Dale, let me springboard off of that and something earlier you said as we talk this next question. So the Department of State is the final signature, and they weigh some different variables, as you said, human rights violations and all that. Who represents the industrial base in that dialogue if FMS is important to sustaining our industrial base, to keep production lines rolling, to help reduce the per unit cost over time for weapons that we know we're going to retain? Is there an industrial base representative out of the government, or is it industry?
It's a great question. I would say there are a couple of different plug-in points for industry. Number one is, you know, in developing the security classification of weapons to decide who is going to be released, what items. It would be down at the PEO level and the relationship that industry has with that appropriate PEO. I'd also say that you know, the review process for congressional notification, you know, goes to state, and industry certainly has an opportunity to plug in there. But when it goes back over to the Hill for congressional notification, there's a 20-day informal process and a 30-day notification period. And I know that industry, plays there with the subcommittees and committees and the full body on the sale of different systems to partners. I don't know if there's an industry representative on these panel or on these committees, or I mean inside the State Department, a standing recurring industry representation. But I do know that industry is very active at those two levels of the PEO and then also at the on the Hill.
My experience, I've just seen industry obviously on the Hill, but also engaging the White House at the National Economic Council. I've been back briefed when that's happened. So I think they're not formally in the system, but they do inject themselves. I think also, I know Ms. Lord, I think she was AT&L. I think now they've divided that up, but I think, she, in her capacity, I think she has a robust engagement with both the R&D side and industry. So I think they get an indirect seat at the table.
Okay, to the panel, how do you recommend a partner or an ally engage in the DoD to best synchronize their modernization efforts with our developmental timelines? What is the entry point?
I've seen that entry point be at the embassy. Sometimes they'll come to us. I've been at a couple of times where they'll express interest in systems. More often than not, at least the ones in the Middle East, usually don't get out in front of these issues, but I've seen at times where they have. I think there's opportunities for them, frankly, to do it a whole lot more. But I think, at least in the Middle East region, they tend not to look at that too hard. But that is in the process of changing. There's a discussion, ongoing right now about this with some of the regional countries.
I would agree with General Rank, especially my experience in the Middle East also is countries will buy a capability and will be unable or unwilling or just don't care about keeping up with how fast the U.S. Army is modernizing. And my experience with that was with tanks in Kuwait. Suddenly, the Kuwaitis found themselves with a standalone tank that no other partner nation had, even though it was an Abrams. No other partner nation had the exact version that they had. So they were having trouble finding spare parts, even though it looked out from the outside as a similar tank to what the U.S. Army was using. All the black boxes and things like that on the inside had changed, and that created a large sustainment program for them.
Okay. Sir, we got about 8 minutes. We could give the panel a minute per person for any closing shots or parting rounds. Del?
I appreciate the opportunity to sit on this. There are great opportunities for the U.S. government industry, along with the international partner, to cooperate more fully across the entire life cycle of security assistance, and that's what I would offer the government consider here. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thanks again to you and your team for the invite, and I look forward to a second invite. Unless I screwed it up in the last 52 minutes and 14 seconds. But if I could just say a couple things, a lot of industry here today. And, my door is always open, and of course I get a legal check. But nonetheless, again, we're a test bed in U.S. Army Europe, and we need you all. Okay, and we need you to think through some of the products and the capabilities, whether it's TADS devices that were mentioned earlier, whether it's a cross-domain solution and so forth, because it goes back to the last question that General Mann presented, or the flip side of it is, we're playing the cards we're dealt right now. So, and some of those include some Soviet era SA2s and 3s and 5s and so forth. So how do we integrate those systems, and how do we again share that regional air picture? So the challenge is there to the industry to help us out, and and we look for that diversity, and not the diversity of a skin color, okay, but the diversity of the mind. And because when you do come to Europe and you come to 10th AAMDC, talk to the young soldiers because there's some brilliance out there amongst those soldiers. We foot stomped foreign disclosure pretty hard. It's a big deal. It's a challenge. It does slow us down. One last point about last summer's big exercise is it took a few days to get a shared air picture, along the eastern flank, pushed it back through the Ciocca and Udom, Germany, and then down to Ramstein. So there are some challenges with the foreign disclosure that we'll continue to chase down. And the last piece is cyber. It's a great concern of mine. I'm sure it's a great concern of everyone's in here. And we've got to recognize that. And we continue to do our part in 10th to educate every soldier from E1 to 06. And it goes back to what was mentioned earlier up here on the panel about the survivability piece, the dispersion piece, the camouflage, the face paint, Greg Brady, and the concealment that we preach daily. And it sounds very elementary, but we're back to those basics in U.S. Army Europe. Thanks again, sir, for letting me participate today. Thank you.
Sir, no closing comments. Thank you again for the invitation out here, and to AUSA for throwing a first-class event here. Look forward to saying howdy to an old 3/8 Cav trooper over here, Sergeant Major Preston, after the event. Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to say three things. One, the forthcoming missile defense review at congressional direction is supposed to have 5- and 10-year statements of intent for both programmatic and political milestones in terms of interoperability and integration. And so that's not out yet. Maybe it'll be out next month. But I look at that and I think about the last BMDR. It had phase 1, 2, 3, 4 for EPAA. But in terms of the other regions, it was, we'll figure that out. It'll be a bilateral thing. We'll figure out in part because of the political complexities. But that congressional direction, I think, kind of pushed a little bit the desire for saying, what exactly is the end game that we ought to be looking at? Rather than merely exhortations for interoperability, what is the exact capability goals in terms of phases that we might want to pursue? So that might be something to look for. The second thing, I'll just repeat my comments earlier about passive defense, including passive defense for our active defense. Because if we're serious about connecting AMD with the NDS, talk about great power competition, survivability and resilience is going to matter more. And then the third point would be, there's these cross-functional teams. One of them's for IAMD, but it's a separate team that is for fires. And I think I owe this observation to General Formica, but if you really want to talk about multifunctional fires and all this kind of stuff, I'd be curious to see where those two teams go in terms of connections. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you. I really enjoyed this and hope to be invited back as well. Just a couple of quick things. As I said earlier, we are at yes with respect to incorporating our allies and partners. Another thing is that we've got we've got to give them credit for what it is that they do contribute, even if that contribution isn't an apples to apples contribution as we would see it. We are making progress, and that's the good news. But I heard it said today that the enemy gets a vote, and we've all heard that over our careers, and the enemy is voting early and often. So I would offer that has got to push us to accelerate the level of integration with our allies and partners so that we can stay ahead of the curve. And then just one last thing, please help yourself to one of our JB Tech, some of our JB Tech documents, and reach out to us. This is really world-class training, and I think your organizations, as so many across the enterprise, would be better for it. Thank you.
Sir, thank you for the invite. Appreciate the opportunity. I guess the last thought I would leave our participants here is building partner capacity. Should it mean that there's a less forward presence? And then if so, how do we actually get our partners to be able to provide that protection for us and maybe critical assets that we have?
Sir, I just wanted to say I never thought there'd be a day when somebody quoted Greg Brady. But, Greg's not here to hear it, so that's okay. But thank you for the opportunity to be here, sir. It's been a great conference.